I was halfway through grilling on my back deck when I heard laughter coming from my backyard, my pool area, to be exact. Not the usual neighborly chuckle, but full-blown party laughter echoing through my hedges. I stepped closer, spatula still in hand, and what I saw made me freeze like someone had slapped me with a wet towel. My pool was packed with people I'd never met, clinking glasses, splashing around, and at the center of it all was Karen, our HOA's self-proclaimed queen bee, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, barking orders like she owned the place. My pool furniture was rearranged, my speakers were blasting pop music, and there was even a banner hanging across my fence that said, HOA Summer Bash. For a moment I genuinely thought I'd walked into an alternate dimension, because last I checked, I hadn't agreed to host any community events, let alone ones run by the same woman who fined me last month for non-regulation fence color. The shock lasted maybe 10 seconds before it turned into a bubbling rage mixed with disbelief. I watched as Karen handed someone a drink from my cooler, the one labeled with my name in permanent marker, and my first thought wasn't even anger, it was confusion. How did she get in? My gate was locked. My cameras were on. The sheer confidence on her face, like this was totally normal, was unreal. I didn't storm in immediately. Instead, I backed away and grabbed my phone. I zoomed in through the hedge, snapping pictures of the madness. There was Karen's husband lounging in my pool chair, her teenage son using my inflatable raft, and 3 HOA board members chatting like they'd just discovered paradise. My blood pressure hit orbit. A week earlier, Karen had left a note on my door about shared community aesthetics and approved pool maintenance times. It was the usual passive-aggressive nonsense she loved to send. What I didn't know was that she was planning to use my house as the HOA's private resort. I'd gone out earlier that day to buy new filters, thinking the pool could use some cleaning before the weekend. Apparently, that was her green light. My lock wasn't broken. She had used a key, one the HOA was supposed to hold only for emergencies. So, while I was gone for 2 hours, Karen had borrowed my property for her own event. The absolute gall left me speechless. When I stepped out into the open and approached the fence, she saw me and had the audacity to wave. "Oh, you're back early," she shouted, her voice dripping with fake cheer. "We thought you were out all day." I stood there gripping the gate handle, barely holding back. "We?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Karen, what exactly is going on here?" She turned, hands on hips, looking at me like I was the one interrupting. "The HOA approved a small gathering for board members. Your pool was the most centrally located and well-kept. It's really just one afternoon." The words slammed into me like ice water. She spoke as if she had done me a favor, like my property was community equipment. "A small gathering?" I said, gesturing to the 30 people splashing, drinking, and eating my food. "This looks like a concert." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You're being dramatic. It's just one day, relax. We'll clean up after." Her husband chimed in from his pool chair. "Yeah man, it's just some fun. Don't be that guy." I wanted to lose it right then, but something in me said no. Instead of screaming, I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, though. It was that quiet, dangerous kind of smile that only appears when the brain starts calculating revenge. "Sure, Karen," I said slowly, "one afternoon. Enjoy it while it lasts." Her face softened, thinking I'd backed down, and she turned away dismissively. I went back inside, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the live camera feed on my phone. They were all still there, laughing and lounging like royalty. My mind started racing. There was no point calling the cops. The HOA would spin it as a misunderstanding. Calling a lawyer would take too long. I needed something immediate, something poetic, something that would burn this day into Karen's memory forever. And that's when I remembered the canisters in my shed, bright blue pool maintenance dye, harmless but vividly staining for 24 hours if not diluted properly. By the time they finished their second round of margaritas, I'd already checked the filtration system and knew exactly when to release it. The plan wasn't about destruction, It was about revelation. About making every single person in that pool remember that it wasn't theirs. But before I could even touch the valve, my neighbor Dave showed up at my door, face pale. Dude, you know Karen told everyone this was your idea, right? She's telling people you sponsored the HOA party to make peace. My jaw clenched. She what? Dave nodded. She said you wanted to build community trust or something. People are calling you generous. I leaned back, laughing under my breath. Generous. That woman was rewriting history in real time. She'd stolen my property, thrown a party, and painted me as the volunteer host. I could feel the tension buzzing behind my eyes, that rare moment when anger becomes energy. I decided not to act immediately. I let them have their illusion. They stayed past sunset, music echoing off the houses, red plastic cups floating like tiny buoys. Every few minutes someone yelled, "Thanks, man," over the fence, and I waved back like the world's most patient host. Inside, though, I was documenting everything. Pictures, timestamps, video clips from my cameras, all evidence. Because Karen didn't just cross a line, she bulldozed it with confetti. Around 10 p.m., I watched her drunkenly stumble into my patio area, rummaging through my fridge for extra ice. That's when she tripped, spilling half a margarita down her expensive white dress. She cursed, wiped it off, then turned to her friends laughing. "Guess the host forgot to refill," she joked. I smiled again. The next morning, the blue dye plan wasn't just an idea, it was a promise. When they finally left, my yard looked like a battlefield. Wet towels everywhere, empty bottles, snack crumbs, and one of my pool chairs bent out of shape. The water was cloudy from sunscreen and spilled drink. I stood there under the porch light, looking at the mess, and whispered, "Enjoy your one afternoon, Karen." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I drafted an email to the HOA, pretending to be polite. I wrote, "Dear Board, I appreciate your initiative to host a community gathering, but next time please obtain written consent before using private property. I trust this was a misunderstanding." I attached photos of the chaos without comment. The message was polite enough to be undeniable, and passive-aggressive enough to sting. The next morning, I got a short reply from Karen herself. "Relax, it's just a pool. Everyone had fun. No harm done." That line sealed her fate. By the end of the week, I'd restocked supplies, cleaned up, and tested the filtration system again. I knew Karen wouldn't resist hosting another gathering soon. It was in her nature. She couldn't stand not being the center of attention, especially after the first event had given her that temporary fame among the HOA members. They called her the social organizer now. It made her glow with smug pride every time she walked her dog past my house. I pretended not to care. I even waved back once. She probably thought I'd forgiven her. In reality, I was preparing the most colorful reminder in neighborhood history. The next time she dipped a toe into my pool, I promised myself she'd never forget who it belonged to. That thought, the idea of poetic justice in liquid blue, stuck in my mind all week. Every time I saw her smirk across the cul-de-sac, every time I heard her gossip about how nice it was that I came around, I smiled quietly. Because she didn't know the water was waiting. The first time she stole my pool, I stood there frozen in disbelief. The next time, I'd be watching, live, with popcorn in hand. And when the dye spread and everyone's perfect white clothes turned bright electric blue, I'd finally see the look I wanted. Panic, shock, humiliation, and maybe, just maybe, a little understanding. That was the plan. And chapter 1 of it had just begun. The day after the party, I felt oddly calm as I walked my dog past Karen's mailbox and saw her basking in the small glory she had created. She had already hung a string of photos from the event on the HOA bulletin board and was practicing that self-satisfied smile that had ruined more than a few neighborhood apologies. I tried to catch her eye, and she looked at me with that practiced uncertainty people use when they have to pretend an awkward thing never happened. She was good at deflection and even better at persuasion, so the next step had to be surgical. I started by compiling evidence while staying outwardly neutral, because nothing feeds an entitled person more than the belief they have gotten away with something. I downloaded footage from my cameras, labeled each clip with date and time, and saved photos showing guests using my pool chairs and my cooler with my name still visible on the lid. I printed a contact sheet and shoved it into an envelope so, when the HOA tried to gaslight me, I could leave hard proof on the table like a polite war trophy. I also spoke with neighbors quietly one by one, because public opinion would tilt the board faster than any email could. Dave admitted he had believed Karen at first when she said I had organized the event, and he had even posted a comment on the thread thanking me for bringing everyone together. After a pause, he looked at me and said he felt bad, and that he had not known she had used my property without consent. Mrs. Alvarez from 2 doors down swore she had seen Karen unlock my gate with a small brass key the week before, as though testing how often it would be left unattended. Mr. Thompson, who managed the clubhouse keys, confessed that several members felt uncomfortable with how Karen had assumed permissions that were not hers to assume. The more stories I collected, the clearer the pattern became, and the more the moral of the story shifted from private insult to civic concern. I emailed the board again, this time with a formal tone and concise bullet points, and attached the evidence package as a file because inertia is a board's best friend and facts are a good antidote. The reply came back surprisingly quick, and contained phrases like misunderstanding and community function, and even a brief apology with the caveat that the HOA would handle it internally. Reading those words was like being handed back a wrapped insult, and I knew their internal handling would mean little more than a sternly worded email to Karen which would not restore the spare chaise I had to throw away. So I called a friendly neighborhood mediator who owed me a favor to ask what legal and procedural steps were available without going full scorched earth. He suggested convening a special board meeting with an agenda item called unauthorized use of private property, which would force the discussion into public record. It was a slow, cold weapon, but procedural maneuvers often win where noise fails because the veneer of civility makes people uncomfortable with denying clear, documented fact. I posted a polite but firm notice on the HOA forum requesting a special meeting, and I attached a clear list of requested actions, including written apology, documented restitution, and a review of key access protocols. Karen responded publicly within minutes with a long post full of empathy language and just enough ambiguity to let people project their version of the event onto it. She wrote she was sorry for any inconvenience, and that as a long-time volunteer she had only wanted to foster community spirit, and that we should all move forward together. Many neighbors commented in support with phrases like "let's not make this into something bigger than it is" and "community matters," and "thanks for bringing people together." That chorus of casual dismissal hurt more than anything else because entitlement does not only steal property, it rewrites reality with well-timed kindness. At the special meeting the room was packed, more curious than hostile, and I walked in with my evidence like an honest man carrying a stack of cards. Karen arrived with a calm, practiced face, and 3 board members who looked like they had been briefed on Crisis Containment 101. She launched into her prepared statement, complete with smiling anecdotes about the laughter and shared desserts, and how she had assumed the host had approved the booking. I presented the photos and the footage and the printed statements from neighbors, and watched the color drain from the faces of the people who had nodded at Karen online without having seen the fact. Her initial expression remained serene, but a tiny tremor in her jaw showed the first sign of panic that polite language could not hide. The board president asked for clarification on the key access, and Mr. Thompson explained that keys are not to be used casually and that the master key is for emergencies only. Karen attempted to argue that there had been an implicit community understanding about shared amenities, but her phrasing slipped into entitlement, and a few people in the room frowned at the language. I kept my voice even, and I refused to let anger make me abrupt, because the spectacle I wanted was not a shouting match but a public accounting. Once the room had the facts, the chant of "let's not make this into something bigger" lost momentum and replaced itself with reasonable questions about liability and insurance and consent. The insurance agent who attended as an advisor leaned forward and explained that unauthorized use of a private pool poses liability risks if someone had been injured, and that the HOA could be on the hook legally. That sentence changed the tenor of the meeting, because suddenly what had been framed as a social misstep became a financial risk, and people pay attention when money is mentioned. Karen tried to pivot to community benefits, but when the conversation turned to written consent and restitution, her words thinned, and she shuffled notes nervously. I suggested a fair remedy that would not humiliate anyone but would prevent future abuses, namely a written policy clarifying that private property is private and that the master key could only be used with explicit homeowner consent. The board debated modestly and eventually voted to adopt a policy draft pending minor edits, and to require Karen to issue a written apology to me, which would be posted on the HOA bulletin. After the meeting, some members approached me with genuine apologies and said they had not known the details and that they regretted the rush to assumption. Dave shook my hand and admitted he regretted his quick online comment and promised to make a correction publicly, which he did later that night, apologizing for endorsing incomplete information. Despite the small victory, I felt no celebration because Karen had already begun the cleanup campaign with a softer voice on the thread, claiming that the apology was a misunderstanding and that the post was meant as a bridge to healing. That line of attack revealed her strategy, which was to use kindness and ambiguity to blunt consequences while keeping social capital intact. I realized then that this was not just about a pool or a party, but about power, how entitlement gets defended by charm and by the inertia of community politeness. So I changed tactics from confrontation to deterrence and from public shaming to preventive planning, because I wanted durable safety for my property, not a fleeting win. I strengthened locks, rekeyed my shed, and installed a secondary lock that required two distinct actions to open, because physical barriers buy time, and time is often all the law need. I also set up a discrete log sheet taped inside the gate area that would record dates and times when anyone used the access key, and I told Mr. Thompson about it under the guise of better record keeping. Meanwhile, I prepared the blue dye plan in careful stages, refining the release timing, the dilution parameters, and confirming that the chemical I planned to use was non-toxic and merely highly visible for 24 hours. I did not see this as malice, rather as a controlled lesson, a wake-up call painted in a color loud enough to be remembered. At the same time, I cultivated allies by helping neighbors with small things: groceries taken in packages moved, a broken mailbox hinge fixed, and a lawn mower that refused to turn given a jump start. Those small acts of neighborliness made people see me as someone reasonable rather than as someone eager for revenge, and it shifted the narrative slowly away from the idea that I was spiteful. Karen misread this as indifference, and in private she said to a mutual friend that I was probably preparing some petty stunt and laughed it off, but she underestimated how patient I could be. The weeks that followed were a careful dance. I logged every interaction, saved every text, and I let the board do what the board needed to do, while I built a safety net around my property and reputation. My friend Maya, who knew a bit about PR, helped me write a short statement clarifying that I valued community but also expected consent before private resources were used, and we framed it as a request for clarity rather than an accusation. The nuance mattered because it made the board and neighbors less defensive and more amenable to procedural changes. In private, I planned the final visible step, the blue that would cut through charm and euphemism like a bright interruption and force a conversation all of its own. I rehearsed the moment in my head, imagining faces turning from smug to shocked, and rehearsed the precise timing so the die would be a revelation, not a freak accident, and so the lesson would be undeniable and unforgettable truly. Karen's apology letter went up on the bulletin board 2 days later, printed on HOA letterhead and framed in careful politeness that made it sound like a thank you note rather than an admission. It said things like misunderstanding and community cohesion and left out any mention of trespassing. Neighbors read it, nodded, and went back to mowing lawns or walking dogs. For most people, it was over. For me, it was a scar under the surface. She had turned my backyard into her private club, rewrote the narrative, and walked away with a smile. I couldn't shake the image of her lounging in my chair, sipping from my cooler, laughing as if I didn't exist. Every time I passed the pool, I felt that quiet burn return. The board had moved on, the neighbors had forgiven, and Karen thought she had neutralized me. She didn't understand that I wasn't angry anymore, I was patient. There's a difference. Anger rushes. Patience plans. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle things. A new thread on the HOA site titled, Summer Celebration Part 2. A few messages mentioning the success of last month's event. Karen was at it again, only this time she was more cautious. She didn't say it would be at my house, but she left the location blank with a winking emoji and a note about keeping surprises alive. People commented excitedly. I kept silent. I let the illusion build, because illusions are easiest to shatter when the crowd believes them most. I spent my evenings cleaning the pool, checking filters, and setting up small, invisible tweaks to the system. The dye wasn't simple food coloring. It was industrial-grade indicator dye I'd ordered weeks ago, used by pool technicians to trace leak. It was harmless, non-toxic, and left the most vivid electric blue imaginable when activated. I diluted and tested it in a bucket behind the shed, making sure it was safe. The way the color spread, like a slow, mesmerizing cloud, made me grin. It would start faint, barely visible, then bloom through the water like a living thing until every drop glowed. I knew the timing now. 15 minutes to full effect once the pump engaged. Karen, meanwhile, had slipped back into her smug routine. I'd see her every morning walking her dog, pretending to scroll on her phone but always angling toward my yard. She'd wave with forced sweetness. "Pool looks great," she'd say, pretending she had no ulterior motives. "You know, we're so lucky to have such a responsible homeowner in our community." I'd smile and say, "Glad you think so," then turn back to my work. Behind that fake civility, we both knew the game wasn't over. Her biggest flaw wasn't cruelty, it was ego. She needed admiration. She needed to be the hero of her little world. So when whispers began circulating about another party, she couldn't resist confirming them. One afternoon, Dave walked over and said casually, "Hey, I heard Karen's planning something again. Says it'll be at a surprise location. You might want to double-check your locks." I nodded, pretending concern. "Thanks, I'll keep an eye out." I didn't tell him that I had already upgraded everything. New padlocks, reinforced hinges, motion sensors tied to my phone. The cameras could now detect faces and alert me by name. Karen's was saved under guest, unauthorized. Every night, I'd get alerts of raccoons, cats, sometimes wind-blown branches, but I waited for the day her name popped up again. When it did, I planned to do more than confront her. I would let her hang herself with her own confidence. But fate handed me the perfect opportunity sooner than I expected. On a Thursday morning, I found a printed flyer taped to my mailbox. HOA Summer Mixer, Saturday evening. Poolside refreshments and music. Casual dress. There was no address, just hosted by HOA Social Chair. That was Karen's title. She hadn't learned. She had simply decided that consequences were optional. The next 48 hours were a mix of precision and quiet excitement. I made sure the pool looked perfect, spotless and inviting. Fresh towels, chairs aligned, lighting soft and warm. Anyone peeking in would assume I'd prepared for guests. I even left the side gate seemingly unlocked. A decoy, rigged with a tiny contact sensor that pinged my phone once opened. Friday night passed uneventfully. By Saturday morning, my alertness turned sharp as a blade. Karen's car passed my house twice, slow, windows down. She was scouting. That afternoon, she stopped to chat, pretending to compliment my new potted plants. Oh, those look wonderful. Are you having company tonight? She asked, fishing for information. I smiled. Just me and the crickets, I said. She laughed awkwardly and said something about seeing me around. I could see the glint of mischief in her eyes, the same look she'd had before the last party. That evening, I turned on the cameras and waited. At exactly 7:46 p.m., my phone buzzed with the sensor alert. Gate opened. A second later, the pool motion lights flickered on. I pulled up the live feed and there she was, Karen, in a floral dress, holding a drink tray, followed by at least 15 people. They streamed in like they owned the place again, setting up music, dragging in snacks, acting like my yard was a public park. The difference this time was that I didn't confront them. I watched. Observing them felt like studying a social experiment. The laughter, the assumptions, the entitlement, it all played out like a movie I'd seen before. Karen strutted to the edge of the pool, made a grand speech about togetherness, and dove in. That was my cue. Inside, I tapped the control on my phone that switched the pump from manual to timed flow. The dye injection tube, hidden behind the skimmer basket, engaged with a quiet click. On the screen, the water rippled normally for the first few minutes. Then, as the dye began to mix, faint swirls appeared around the swimmers, subtle at first, like streaks of smoke underwater. Within 10 minutes, the transformation began. The blue intensified until the entire pool shimmered like glowing sapphire under the lights. Karen surfaced laughing, flicking her hair back until someone screamed. A shriek cut through the music. "What's wrong with the water?" another voice shouted. People scrambled out, dripping bright blue trails onto the deck. The dye clung to skin and fabric, leaving ghostly streaks that looked like they'd bathed in neon paint. Someone yelled, "It's chemical!" Another cried, "Is it toxic?" Panic erupted in SE. I muted the feed and stepped outside, pretending confusion. "What's happening?" I called, keeping my tone neutral. The crowd froze when they saw me. Karen, still in the pool, stared at her hands turning turquoise. "What did you do?" she screamed. "What did I do?" I echoed, looking around like I was just as shocked. "You're in my pool again?" She sputtered. "We were just using it for a quick dip. You didn't say we couldn't." The absurdity of her defense almost made me laugh. "Karen, it's private property," I said. "And you broke in again." She tried to climb out but slipped, leaving streaks of blue down the tiles. People were running, their clothes stained, their shoes squeaking blue puddles down the driveway. Dave appeared on his porch with his phone out, filming. "Oh my God," he whispered. "It's like a smurf apocalypse." Karen grabbed a towel and glared at me, trembling with humiliation. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I'll tell the HOA you sabotaged the pool, endangered us." I held up my phone, showing the live footage. "Endangered? It's just harmless dye. You might want to ask yourself how you got in before you file that complaint." Her face twisted, realization dawning that she'd been caught on camera again. Around her, the blue-stained guests were shouting and trying to scrub the color off their skin. Some were crying from embarrassment. A few had their phones out, filming the spectacle themselves, because in the age of the internet, nobody can resist a train wreck. Within an hour, the crowd dispersed, leaving a trail of wet footprints and discarded cup. My yard looked like a scene from an art project gone wrong. Karen's car tires left faint blue marks on the street as she sped off. I stood by the fence, listening to the last echoes of chaos fade into the night, then walked back inside and poured myself a drink. I watched the playback one more time, not out of cruelty but closure. I had given her every chance to do the right thing. Instead, she'd turned my patience into her playground. Now the entire neighborhood had seen the truth, not from my words, but from her own arrogance. The next morning, the HOA group chat exploded. Screenshots of blue-stained guests flooded the thread. Some people laughed, some were furious, and a few tried to spin it as a misunderstanding again. But the pictures told their own story. Karen stayed silent for most of the day. By evening, a short message appeared from her account. An unfortunate mishap occurred during a private gathering. It has been resolved. No apology, no accountability, just damage control. But it was too late. The neighborhood had its entertainment for the year, and I had my peace. For the first time in weeks, I felt that rare satisfaction that doesn't need word. Karen had painted her reputation the same color as the water she stole, and there was no bleach strong enough to wash it clean. By the next morning the entire neighborhood buzzed like a gossip hive dipped in caffeine and embarrassment. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating from messages half shocked, half amused. Screenshots of blue-streaked guests circulated like wildfire, and the footage from Dave's camera had already found its way onto a local community Facebook group under the title HOA Pool Party Turns Smuff Disaster. There were hundreds of comments, everything from jokes about alien water to speculation about toxic waste. Karen was suddenly a local celebrity, though not in the way she had always imagined. When I took my morning walk, the air was thick with whispers from porches and chuckles from driveways. Everyone knew. I saw Karen's car parked crookedly in front of her house, and though she usually strutted out at this hour with her dog and coffee cup, her blinds were now tightly shut. It was poetic that the same woman who once monitored everyone else's lawns was now hiding behind her curtains. I felt satisfied but oddly unsettled too, because I knew Karen's ego wasn't built to accept defeat quietly. She was a chronic redeemer, the type who believed any scandal could be rewritten with enough spin and sympathy. So when I heard from Mrs. Alvarez that Karen had already contacted the HOA Emergency Committee for a special session, I wasn't surprised. The meeting was set for that afternoon, and I decided to attend, not to argue but to watch. The room smelled of disinfectant and nervous energy as people filtered in clutching papers and half-formed opinions. Karen entered 10 minutes late, wearing oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat as if disguising herself for a courtroom drama. Her skin still had faint blue patches around the neck, where the dye hadn't fully faded. The board president cleared his throat and asked everyone to remain civil. Karen began her speech in that slow performative tone she used when she wanted to sound wounded yet noble. She claimed that she and her guests had been invited informally, that she believed I had forgiven the past misunderstanding, and that what happened with the water was a deliberate act of humiliation meant to target her personally. She spoke of distress, ruined clothing, and potential health risks, even though the dye had already been confirmed harmless by the local pool service. Her voice cracked perfectly on cue as she said the word betrayed, and a few sympathetic heads nodded. I stayed quiet, letting her dig the emotional trench deeper. Then the president turned to me and asked for my version. I said calmly that my property had been used without consent twice, that I had video evidence of trespass and forced entry, and that the so-called incident was the natural result of her own disregard for boundaries. I didn't mention the dye mechanism directly, only that routine maintenance products had been left in the system as part of standard upkeep. For the first time Karen's composure faltered. She blurted that nobody had permission to use private chemicals in a shared community event, and the irony of that statement drew a few chuckles around the room. The board asked for clarity on the key issue again, and Mr. Thompson repeated that no authorization was given for the event and that Karen's key privileges were suspended pending review. She tried to argue, saying the gate was unlocked, but the footage clearly showed her using the master key to enter. The moment the video played, the tone of the room changed. Gasps and murmurs rippled as the image of Karen smiling while unlocking my gate froze on screen. It was impossible to deny. One of the quieter board members muttered that this was beyond HOA jurisdiction and might require civil mediation. Karen's voice rose, trembling with anger now that sympathy had slipped away. She accused me of setting her up, of orchestrating the situation to destroy her standing. I said nothing. The less I spoke, the more her control eroded. When the meeting ended, the board issued a temporary suspension of her social committee position and recommended she cover the cost of pool cleaning and minor property repairs. It wasn't much, but it was official. That formality mattered. The paper trail meant she couldn't rewrite the story later. Still, she refused to accept any blame. Outside in the parking lot, she confronted me privately, leaning close enough for me to smell the citrus perfume mixing with chlorine. Her voice was low and sharp. "You think you won," she said. "You humiliated me in front of everyone." I replied quietly that I hadn't done anything except maintain my own property. She pointed a manicured finger at me and promised that everyone would see who the real problem was. Then she stormed off, heels clicking like warning shots. I watched her go and realized she wasn't finished. She was regrouping. Over the next few days, Karen's redemption campaign went into full swing. She posted long, emotional messages online about forgiveness and community, painting herself as a victim of misunderstanding and mob judgment. She shared inspirational quotes about resilience and personal growth, followed by staged photos of her helping at a food drive. It might have worked too if not for the blue stains still haunting her. Every time she appeared in public, someone would whisper about the dye or jokingly ask if she'd been swimming again. Her reputation didn't just bruise, it fluoresced. A week later, an anonymous user posted a slowed version of the pool video with dramatic music and subtitles. It went viral locally, getting thousands of views. The comment section was merciless but funny, filled with puns about Blue Mondays and chlorine karma. Karen reported the video, but the internet had already claimed it. I stayed quiet through it all, pretending disinterest. I mowed my lawn, waved at neighbors, went about normal routines. But inside, part of me worried about escalation. People like Karen rarely retreat permanently, they mutate. I upgraded my locks again, installed an additional camera facing the street, and set alerts to record any car that stopped near my gate. Late one night, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk and muted voices, then a soft thunk against my mailbox. The next morning, I found a flyer accusing me of being a troublemaker, saying I used chemicals irresponsibly and endangered children. It was unsigned, printed in bold letters on cheap paper. The grammar matched Karen's style perfectly. I kept one copy for evidence and shredded the rest. I didn't confront her. I understood that silence unnerves an aggressor more than rebuttal. As days passed, things began to settle into an odd peace. The HOA quietly replaced Karen as social chair, citing the need for new leadership. A new neighbor volunteered, a cheerful woman named Janice who immediately announced a legitimate, authorized block barbecue in the community park. She personally invited me and insisted I bring my own grill to show off my famous burgers. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Karen wasn't invited, though she tried to appear anyway. When she arrived, wearing a bright yellow sundress and forced smile, conversations stopped mid-sentence. People acknowledged her politely but moved on quickly. For someone who thrived on attention, that polite neglect was worse than open hostility. She stayed for 10 minutes, pretended to get a phone call, and left. That night, as the smell of grilled meat lingered and the laughter of kids faded, Dave sat beside me with a beer and said, "You really handled that whole thing with style, man." I shrugged. I just wanted my peace back. He grinned and said, "You got it, and then some. Even the HOA respects you now. They said you were firm but fair." I laughed quietly, realizing that my silent patience had become reputation armor. I hadn't shouted, threatened, or lost composure once. In a neighborhood ruled by gossip and perception, that mattered more than any written report. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was plotting something new. She was too prideful to let the story end on her humiliation. A few days later, she tried a new tactic. I found a small envelope in my mailbox with no stamp. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "I hope you're proud of what you did. People can be cruel, but I forgive you." Signed, Karen. The handwriting was shaky, performative humility leaking from every curve of the letters. I folded it neatly and stored it with the other evidence. If she wanted to play saint now, I would let her. The community had already drawn their conclusions. Each time I walked past her house, I saw the blue-tinted curtains drawn tight, as if she was still hiding from the light that had exposed her. Then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from the HOA legal committee informing me that Karen had filed a complaint claiming chemical misuse and requesting inspection of my pool. It was laughable, but I welcomed it. I invited the inspector over, provided receipts, product details, and even offered a water sample. The man tested it, confirmed it was harmless, and wrote in his report that there was no evidence of any violation. When the results were posted publicly as per policy, the final sliver of Karen's credibility snapped. She didn't appear at the next meeting. Her husband came instead, awkward and quiet, submitting her resignation from all committees. The neighborhood exhaled collectively, relief mixed with amusement. That evening, I sat by the pool alone. The water was perfectly clear again, reflecting the orange of the setting sun. I could still picture the blue chaos from that night, the panic, the shouting, the absurd beauty of justice unfolding through color. I thought about how simple the revenge had been, not destructive, just revealing. People like Karen thrive in shadows of assumption. Shine light, or in this case, die on them, and they crumble. As the first crickets began to chirp, I raised my glass slightly toward the empty yard across the street. Maybe she was watching through her blinds, maybe not. Either way, I whispered softly to the water, "Here's to boundaries." Then I laughed to myself, because in the end, that was all I ever wanted. Respect painted in truth, not blue but permanent all the same. Months later, life in the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm so peaceful it almost felt unnatural after everything that had happened. The gossip had finally faded into distant memory and people had new things to talk about, like the upcoming park renovation or the annual yard competition. My name no longer came up in conversations except when someone wanted advice on pool maintenance or property boundaries. I had become the unofficial calm guy of the community, the one who handled conflict without yelling, which amused me because a year earlier I had been the guy everyone thought was difficult for standing up to Karen. Time has a way of rewriting reputations, especially when the truth finally sits long enough to become fact. Every morning I'd sit on the same deck where this story had begun and sip my coffee while the pool shimmered silently, a mirror of calm where once there had been chaos. Sometimes, when the light hit the water just right, I'd almost imagine a faint glimmer of blue deep below the surface, as though the water still remembered its most dramatic day. Dave had become one of my closest friends through it all. We laughed often about how we met because of Karen's nonsense. He'd stop by in the evenings with a beer and a grin, leaning on the fence to recount new neighborhood gossip. One night he said he'd heard from a realtor friend that Karen's new neighborhood was already having committee issues. Apparently she had tried to start a new HOA social club there too, and the pattern was repeating itself. I couldn't help but laugh, not out of malice but because it confirmed something I had learned through this whole ordeal. Some people never change, they just relocate their chaos. I wished her no harm. If anything, I hoped the next community handled her better or at least had someone willing to draw boundaries early before she steamrolled them the way she had almost done here. Around that time I decided to do something symbolic. For months the pool had been the reminder of what happened, but now I wanted it to be something more, a marker of renewal instead of revenge. I drained it halfway, scrubbed the tiles spotless, replaced a few that had faint discoloration from the dye, and refilled it with fresh water. It took almost 2 days of work, but when it was done, the pool gleamed like it was brand new. I threw a small get-together for the neighbors who had stood by me during the ordeal, Dave, the Alvarezes, and even Mr. Thompson from the board who had since become much friendlier. We grilled, shared stories, and laughed until late in the night. For the first time since I'd moved into this neighborhood, the laughter around my pool wasn't stolen. It was invited, earned, and pure. During the party, Mrs. Alvarez raised her glass and said that it was nice to have the neighborhood feeling like a community again, without all the petty drama. I nodded and said softly that sometimes people forget how thin the line is between neighborly and nosy. Everyone laughed at that, but I could tell they understood what I meant. The pool incident had become a quiet legend, a cautionary tale dressed in humor, and now it served as a reminder to respect each other's space. It was strange how something that started in frustration had ended up creating harmony. Even the HOA had changed its tone, becoming more cooperative and transparent. Meetings were less about rules and more about improvement. The new president even asked me to review a few drafts of their policy updates before final approval. I found it ironic and satisfying that the very man once targeted by fines was now helping write fairer rules. One evening, months after that, a car pulled up in front of my driveway as I was closing the garage. It was Karen's car, unmistakable as ever, but a bit older now, paint slightly faded. She stepped out wearing a modest jacket and no sunglasses this time. She looked different, smaller somehow, not physically but in presence. She walked up to the gate and asked if we could talk for a moment. I hesitated, not out of anger but surprise. She said she was just passing through town and wanted to say something before leaving for good. Against my better judgment, I agreed. She stood on the other side of the gate, eyes lowered, and said she'd been angry at first, embarrassed, and had blamed everyone but herself. She admitted she had been wrong to use my property, wrong to assume authority she didn't have, and wrong to twist the truth. She said she'd lost more than reputation. She'd lost friends, trust, and the version of herself she thought was right. Her voice trembled when she said the dye incident had been her wake-up call, that seeing herself panicking on video had forced her to realize how ridiculous she had looked trying to control everything. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. There was a long pause broken only by the faint hum of crickets and the sound of water lapping softly in the pool. Finally, I told her that everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is whether they learn from them. I said that I wasn't angry anymore, and that I hoped she found peace somewhere new, maybe in a place where she didn't need to be in charge to feel valued. She nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, then smiled faintly and said she'd heard from a friend that the blue dye was harmless but unforgettable. I laughed quietly and said, that was the point. We both chuckled awkwardly, and for a strange moment, the air felt lighter. She thanked me for hearing her out, got back into her car, and drove away. I watched her taillights disappear around the corner, and realized that was the real ending. Not revenge, not humiliation, but closure. The next morning, I found a small card slipped under my gate. It was from Karen, with just one line written in careful handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me what boundaries really mean." It wasn't signed with flourish or apology, just simple sincerity. I tucked it into the folder with all the old documents and photos, the one I had planned to eventually throw out but never did. It no longer felt like evidence of conflict, it felt like history, a chapter that had taught me patience, cunning, and restraint. As the seasons changed again, life moved on completely. New families moved into Karen's old house, young parents with 2 kids who often waved excitedly when they saw me outside. They brought warmth and laughter back to that space. On summer afternoons, I'd hear their kids playing in their small inflatable pool, squealing with joy, and I'd smile knowing the water in this. Later that night after everyone left, I sat alone with a quiet drink and thought about how strange it was that one person's entitlement had accidentally given me the gift of clarity. Karen's arrogance had forced me to become patient, disciplined, strategic qualities I hadn't used in years. Her chaos had shaped my calm. I realized then that revenge isn't always about hurting someone back, but about reclaiming the balance they disturbed. By teaching her that lesson in color, I had taught myself something deeper about restraint. The next morning when I woke up early and looked at the pool reflecting the first light, I smiled, because it was as clear as my conscience. Still, the story wasn't completely forgotten. Every so often a newcomer to the neighborhood would mention it after hearing whispers or seeing the viral clip. They'd laugh nervously and ask if it was true, and I'd answer only with a small grin, saying sometimes water remembers what people forget. It always made them laugh, but there was truth beneath it. The pool might have been cleaned, but its history was etched into the memory of everyone who had witnessed that ridiculous, unforgettable day. The HOA never held another unsanctioned event after that, and whenever new rules were drafted they always included a clause about private property and consent clearly underlined. That single paragraph felt like a small personal monument to everything that had happened. As autumn arrived and leaves began to fall, I felt that rare sense of finality. Karen was gone, the drama had evaporated, and the neighborhood had healed in its own imperfect way. Sometimes I wondered if she ever told her new neighbors about what happened, or if she pretended it never existed. Maybe she reinvented herself as a victim again, or maybe she finally learned to mind her own boundaries. Either way, it didn't matter. My world had moved on. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees and the moonlight rippled across the pool's surface, I whispered softly thank you, not to her exactly, but to the strange chain of events that had turned humiliation into victory and anger into calm. The water shimmered quietly as if acknowledging it understood. The weeks that followed were almost quiet enough to make me forget the chaos, but not quite, because silence has a way of carrying the echo of what was once loud. Every morning I would sit on the deck with coffee and look at the still water of my pool, remembering how that same surface had erupted into blue panic and laughter and disbelief. I thought it was over then. I realized with people like Karen nothing truly ends, it only goes underground, waiting for the next opportunity to crawl back into daylight. She had vanished from the meetings and public gatherings, but she was not gone entirely, because gossip travels faster than absence. Neighbors whispered that she was planning to move, others said she was suing the HOA for defamation, and a few claimed she had taken up meditation and therapy to deal with stress. I didn't believe any of it until one humid afternoon, when I saw her walking toward my property, holding a white envelope like a peace flag that might be hiding a dagger. I stayed calm, waiting by the fence. As she approached, her expression tight, her posture rehearsed. She said she wanted to clear the air once and for all, and that continuing hostility served no one. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, and for a moment I almost felt pity, until I remembered the night of trespass and the humiliation she had caused me. I asked what she wanted exactly, and she said she was moving but needed a statement from me for the record saying that the incident was resolved amicably so she could remove the stain from her record when applying to new neighborhood. The irony of her choice of words, stain and record, nearly made me laugh, but I stayed still. I told her I would think about it, and she looked surprised, maybe because she had expected either an immediate no or an emotional argument, but my calmness disarmed her. She handed me the envelope and walked away without looking back. Inside was a draft letter already written for me to sign, claiming the event had been a misunderstanding and that I had exaggerated it out of personal frustration. The gall of it was stunning even for her. I folded it carefully, put it in a folder with all the other evidence, and decided that if she wanted closure she would have to earn it honestly. That night I called the HOA president and explained that Karen had contacted me about revising history again, and he sighed audibly, saying she had already filed a request to have her suspension lifted before leaving the community. I told him I wasn't interested in punishment anymore, only in ensuring she couldn't manipulate the record. He promised to attach my prior evidence to the permanent file and thanked me for my patience. That was enough for me, but Karen wasn't done yet. 2 days later, a delivery truck stopped at my gate and left a large package with my name on it. I opened it to find a fancy gift basket filled with scented candles, wine, and a note reading peace, offering no hard feelings. It was meant to look generous, but it felt like a final performance, a desperate attempt to rewrite her exit scene. I called Dave over and showed him the basket, and we both burst out laughing, because even he knew Karen's brand of kindness came with a receipt of expectation. We toasted with the wine anyway, because if someone wants to buy your forgiveness, you might as well enjoy the bottle before throwing away the rest. That evening Dave told me that the viral video of the blue pool had reached another level, now being shared on a meme page where people added captions like "When HOA Power Meets Chemistry Class." He said it had millions of views across platforms, and some people even thought it was fake because it seemed too poetic to be real. I shrugged, pretending indifference, but secretly I found the poetic symmetry satisfying because the story had grown bigger than the petty argument that started it. It had become a fable about boundaries and arrogance wrapped in comedy. One morning while trimming the hedge, I noticed Karen's house with boxes stacked by the driveway and a for sale sign leaning against the wall. She was moving sooner than I expected. I watched as movers loaded furniture, while she stood giving instructions with clipped authority, though her voice had lost its confident edge. The neighbors didn't gather to say goodbye, and that quiet absence said more than words. Later that afternoon she drove by slowly one last time, rolling down her window and saying without meeting my eyes, "I hope you enjoy your peace now." I replied I already do, and she gave a stiff nod before driving away. Watching her car disappear felt like watching a storm cloud finally drift past, leaving behind damp but clearer air. The neighborhood felt lighter immediately, as though everyone had been waiting for this ending subconsciously. In the following weeks, life resumed its normal rhythm, but with subtle differences. The new HOA leadership began sending newsletters that actually focused on helpful updates instead of fines and restrictions. Janice, the new social chair, organized events where people genuinely showed up without fear of gossip or hidden agendas. The same neighbors who once hesitated to speak to me now waved enthusiastically, and some even joked about borrowing my pool, properly this time with written consent. I laughed each time, but inside I guarded that pool like sacred ground, not out of fear anymore but pride. It had become a symbol of quiet resistance, of standing firm without shouting. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low painting everything in amber light, I received a letter from a law office in another state. My first thought was that it might be Karen again, but it turned out to be something entirely different. The lawyer represented a small production company that wanted permission to adapt my experience for a short film about neighborhood conflict. They had found the viral video and tracked down my name through the HOA public record. The idea made me laugh out loud because life had gone full circle from frustration to internet folklore. I didn't say yes immediately, but I kept the letter on my desk thinking maybe someday I'd let the story be told properly. Despite the calm around me, a small part of me missed the absurd drama, because peaceful neighborhoods can be too quiet once the villains leave. Sometimes I'd catch myself replaying the night of the blue water in my mind, the way the color had spread like truth itself, unstoppable once released. It reminded me that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or cruel, but creative enough to reveal what words can't. Dave joked that I should write a book called The Pool Chronicles, and maybe I will someday. For now I just live quietly, tending to my garden, talking to neighbors who actually smile with sincerity, and occasionally glancing at the crystal-clear pool that once mirrored chaos. One particularly hot afternoon months later, I hosted a small barbecue for a few friends. It was simple and light-hearted, no HOA involvement, no drama. People laughed genuinely this time, the kind of laughter that carries no hidden judgment. Someone jokingly asked if I still kept dye hidden somewhere, and I grinned, saying not anymore, the lesson worked too well. Everyone chuckled and toasted to that. The sense of community felt real, finally built on trust instead of manipulation. I noticed how the sunset reflected off the calm water, turning it gold instead of blue, and I thought how fitting that was. The gold meant warmth and closure, while the blue had meant exposure and reckoning.